Have you ever stopped to think about what really happened in the Garden of Eden? The narrative we were told may not be as simple as it seems. Were Adam and Eve just victims of disobedience or agents of something much bigger? Perhaps even a deliberate plan of God. Eden, with its intriguing serpent and the tree of knowledge, would not just be the setting for an impulsive act, but the stage for a profound mystery that shaped the destiny of humanity. What if what we call the fall was not a punishment, but a carefully orchestrated liberation, a choice that opened doors to a level of consciousness that, to this day, we barely understand? Imagine, for a moment, that everything we know about Eden is incomplete, or worse, has been distorted. Why would God place the tree of knowledge within reach of Adam and Eve if it was so dangerous? Why allow the presence of the serpent, a symbol of temptation, in the center of paradise? These questions lead to a fascinating dilemma. Was the fall a mistake, as many believe, or part of a larger plan, perhaps a carefully guarded divine secret? This possibility not only intrigues, but also challenges everything we have learned about the purpose of creation. And here's the invitation. In this video, we will explore what lies beyond the official versions, delving into apocryphal narratives, occult symbolisms, and spiritual interpretations that have been forgotten or deliberately censored. Prepare to question, reflect, and perhaps discover that Eden is not just a place lost in time, but a coded story waiting to be unlocked. After all, what really happened in that garden? And more importantly, how does it still affect us today? Stay until the end, because the answers could change the way you see the world and yourself. They say that Adam and Eve walked through Eden, but have we ever wondered if these names carry something beyond mere literalness? The Book of Adam and Eve, one of the most fascinating and, of course, widely censored texts, offers details that transform the image of these characters. Adam, the one who dedicated himself to penance and angelic advice, and Eve, consumed by repentance, appear as mirrors of the human condition. Aren't they, then, more than historical figures, but universal archetypes that symbolize our search for redemption and wisdom? What if these reports, in addition to being enigmatic, had been purposely persecuted to prevent us from understanding our own essence? It is interesting to note how the Sumerian narratives speak of Enki and Ninhursag, whose deeds echo in the myth of Eden. There, Doman Garden is described as a paradise of purity, where humanity began its contact with the gods. Doesn't that sound familiar? Could Eden be a cultural adaptation or a shared universal symbol? Some scholars even suggest that this connection is not mere coincidence, but a trace of hidden knowledge that transcends civilizations. After all, who decides which stories deserve to be remembered and which ones should be excluded from the collective memory? Think about the impact this symbolism has on our beliefs. Adam and Eve, as described in these ancient manuscripts, seem to transcend mere humanity and touch something deeper, the spiritual prototype of man and woman. But why, then, were these more humanized and complex views marginalized? Could it be because they offer a vision that is beyond the control of traditional narratives? Does the idea that we are more than condemned creatures threaten the power structure that has always defined sin as inevitable and redemption as a privilege? Even more interesting is to reflect on how ancient texts explore the idea of Eden as both a physical and spiritual place. Wouldn't this Eden be a way of inviting us to look inside, in search of a lost consciousness? This becomes even more provocative when we realize that, throughout history, this vision of a spiritually evolving humanity has been systematically censored. And what about the metaphors that continue to echo, even though they are so deliberately erased from canonical scriptures? If Adam and Eve are not only historical figures, but also symbols of a spiritual process, what does this mean for us today? Perhaps Eden was never lost, but rather reinterpreted to keep its true meaning out of the reach of most. Meanwhile, the excluded texts continue to offer glimpses of a greater truth, waiting for those who dare to go beyond convention. By the way, about these conventions, Wouldn't the idea of original sin be a perfect example of how profound concepts were shaped to serve theological interests? Original sin has always been described as a tragedy, an irremediable error that sealed the fate of humanity. But what if we look with different eyes? In the book of Adam and Eve, the fall is narrated in a much more complex way, almost as a necessary act for human learning. Imagine an immaculate but stagnant humanity, unable to grow due to lack of challenges. And so, a mistake that is not just a mistake, but a divine permission for man to experience duality. Has guilt been turned into a tool of control, while true purpose has been deliberately excluded from accepted interpretations? Traditional theology insists on legacies of guilt, something inherited from Adam and perpetuated through all generations. But was guilt really the focus of the narrative? Texts like Romans 5:12 can be read less literally, suggesting that sin did not enter the world as condemnation, but as an invitation to growth. This perspective, naturally, is of no interest to institutions that thrive on maintaining power over the masses. After all, a people who believe they are intrinsically condemned are much easier to manipulate, and the idea of redemption becomes a precious commodity. The most curious thing is how the book of Adam and Eve emphasizes the constant presence of God and his angels. Even after the fall, Adam and Eve, far from being abandoned, are accompanied at every step, receiving guidance and comfort. Wouldn't this be an indication that the fall was not an absolute punishment, but part of a greater plan? This view, however, would deconstruct the traditional concept of sin as something forbidden and irrevocable. And perhaps that is why it was so vehemently excluded from the biblical canon. Historically, the idea of original sin has also served as a powerful political tool. For centuries, the church has used the narrative of inherited guilt to justify controlling practices such as the sale of indulgences and unquestioning submission to the clergy. However, apocryphal texts, such as the book of Adam and Eve, suggest that human suffering is a stage, not a final destination. It is almost ironic to think that redemption, so preached as a divine gift, could actually be a recognition of our own ability to overcome. And here's the reflection. If original sin was not an absolute error, but a freedom granted, what does that mean for our lives today? Perhaps the story we are told is just a part of the whole, carefully shaped to suit specific interests. This perspective, of course, raises another even more provocative question. Was the fall actually a divine gift in disguise? Perhaps the answer lies in another prohibited interpretation and, therefore, relegated to oblivion. After all, what can we say about the tree of knowledge and its role in this plot? When we think of the fall of Adam and Eve, most of us are led to imagine it as a tragic mistake. But what if the story goes deeper than that? In the book of Adam and Eve, frequent visits from angels suggest that the fall may have been a planned step in human growth. After all, how could humanity mature without knowing good and evil? It is intriguing to note that in Genesis 3:22, God himself says, "The man became like one of us, knowing good and evil." This speech, often ignored, sounds less like condemnation and more like recognition of a new level of consciousness. The tree of knowledge, treated as a symbol of disobedience, can be seen in another light, a portal to spiritual enlightenment. Many esoteric traditions, such as Kabbalah, see this event as a necessary movement for humanity to awaken. Isn't it curious that, after the fall, Adam and Eve became not only conscious, but also creative? They dress in leaves, feel ashamed, and start making decisions. If this isn't evolution, what is? However, this vision of deliberate spiritual progress remains largely censored by traditional readings. Details from the book of Adam and Eve also indicate divine care during exile. God allows angels to guide and comfort Adam and Eve, suggesting that the fall was just the beginning of a greater journey. Wouldn't it be strange for a punitive God to maintain such closeness to the fallen? This duality raises an interesting question. What if God's purpose was never to prevent access to knowledge, but to ensure that it was acquired at the right time, a perspective as transformative as it is disturbing. Furthermore, the Tree of Knowledge sparks intriguing parallels in other cultures. In Sumerian mythology, the goddess Inanna descends to the underworld in search of wisdom, facing similar challenges. In Kabbalah, the search for spiritual knowledge is portrayed as an arduous but rewarding ascent. Wouldn't the fall of Adam and Eve be a reflection of these universal myths, hiding encoded spiritual truths? Upon realizing these connections, it becomes evident that the forbiddance is not just a limitation, but an invitation to discovery. And here's the question: if knowledge was a freedom granted, why does the dominant narrative insist on calling it a transgression? Perhaps because a conscious and awake human being is much more difficult to control. But there's something more. The exclusion of texts like the Book of Adam and Eve deprives us of understanding that the fall was the beginning of a journey, not its end. With this in mind, wouldn't it be time to reflect on the reasons behind the exclusion of this text from the biblical canon? Or rather, why did certain books disappear, leaving a trail of disturbing questions about what was really inconvenient to reveal? It is curious how certain texts, no matter how old and rich they are, simply disappear from official scriptures. The Book of Adam and Eve is a perfect example of this. Widely accepted among the first Christians, it presents a vision of humanity that differs from the traditional narrative. Adam and Eve not as eternally condemned, but as apprentices under the guidance of God. Imagine what it would be like for religious institutions to deal with this idea. A humanity capable of direct redemption would perhaps not need intermediaries. And this, let's face it, would be inconvenient for a theology that relies on the control of narratives. It is no surprise that the Book of Adam and Eve was excluded during the councils that defined the canon. These meetings, more political than spiritual, had the power to shape religion according to specific interests. The text offers an optimistic vision where the fall is not the end, but the beginning of a journey accompanied by God, something very far from the perpetual guilt preached by the doctrines. Perhaps that is why it has been relegated to oblivion as forbidden knowledge, too dangerous for the maintenance of power structures. Another fascinating point is how this book connects Eden to paradises described in other traditions, such as the Avesta of Persian mythology. There, we find descriptions of idyllic places where humanity lived in harmony before divine intervention. These similarities are disturbing, as they suggest that Eden is not a biblical exclusive, but an adaptation of universal myths. What happens when we realize that the scriptures were not only inspired by God, but also influenced by ancient cultures? The reaction, of course, was to exclude what didn't fit. Furthermore, the Book of Adam and Eve presents passages that directly contradict the doctrine of original sin. In it, Adam and Eve are accompanied by angels, who offer them comfort and instructions. There is no eternal damnation, but a continuous relationship with the divine. This raises a provocative question. What if God's purpose was never to punish, but to educate? What would happen if people started to believe that redemption is accessible to everyone, without the need for intermediaries? The church, fearing this spiritual independence, chose to silence these voices. So, why do we continue to accept the exclusion of such rich texts? Perhaps because the dominant narrative has been repeated for so long that we have forgotten to question it. But the truth is that books like this have the power to free us, showing us a closer and less dogmatic spirituality. And when thinking about this, another disturbing question arises. Would the Garden of Eden, described as inaccessible, be a lost physical place or something deeper, a state of consciousness to which we can still return? For centuries, the Garden of Eden was imagined as a lost paradise, a place of perfection that humanity could never recover. But what if this interpretation is wrong? The Book of Adam and Eve describes Eden as physically inaccessible after the fall, surrounded by cherubim and a flaming sword. However, many mystical traditions, including Hermeticism and Gnosticism, suggest that Eden is actually a state of consciousness. An internal place, not external, that represents unity with the divine. Could it be possible that this garden never existed in the physical world, but is hidden within each of us? The idea that Eden is a state of consciousness finds support in passages such as Luke 17:21, where Jesus says that the kingdom of God is within us. This leads us to reflect. What if original sin is just a loss of this divine consciousness, an exchange of unity for dualism? Isn't it fascinating to think that humanity, by eating the fruit, gained the ability to distinguish between good and evil, but lost connection with the whole? It's as if the fall was less about disobedience and more about a choice to experience the fragmented world. Furthermore, there are intriguing parallels in other cultures that reinforce this idea. In Hinduism, the concept of moksha, or enlightenment, is seen as the return to unity with the divine. In Gnosticism, the objective is to reach the pleroma, the state of divine plenitude. These narratives echo what Eden may symbolize, an invitation to transcend mundane experience and return to the sacred. Wouldn't it be surprising to discover that this idea has been intentionally hidden, turning Eden into an unattainable utopia rather than an accessible path to self-knowledge? Historically, the physical interpretation of Eden served to cement the narrative that the fall was a catastrophic event rather than a process of spiritual evolution. By positioning Eden as a literal location, institutions ensured that a return to paradise was seen as impossible without divine mediation. But if Eden is a state of mind, as mystical traditions claim, then the key to its recovery lies in ourselves. A powerful yet subversive message that has been deliberately censored over the centuries. And now comes the burning question. If Eden is a state of consciousness, what does this mean for our spiritual journey? Maybe we were never really cast out, but just looked away from what was always inside us. This view, of course, completely changes the narrative. What if the serpent, seen as the symbol of the fall, actually pointed us to this path of self-knowledge? A symbol that deserves to be explored more carefully. From the beginning, the serpent was painted as a villain, responsible for the fall of humanity. But does this vision do justice to the complexity of the narrative? In the book of Adam and Eve, the serpent is directly identified as Satan, a manipulative being who deceives Eve. However, in esoteric and mystical traditions, this symbol carries a very different meaning. The snake, in many cultures, represents wisdom, transformation, and spiritual awakening. Wouldn't it be provocative to imagine that her role in Eden was much more of an instigator than an antagonist? In Hinduism, for example, Kundalini energy, often symbolized by a serpent, is what leads to spiritual awakening. It rests at the base of the spine, waiting to be activated to illuminate human consciousness. Wouldn't this be the perfect parallel to what happens in Eden? When eating the fruit, Adam and Eve open their eyes. They become aware of themselves. Of course, this comes with a cost, but it also comes with an undeniable gain: the ability to discern. The serpent, then, would be a figure that challenges the status quo, leading to enlightenment, but being treated as a villain for it. Even more intriguing is the serpent's speech in Genesis 3-5. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This promise was not entirely false. Adam and Eve did acquire knowledge, even though it was accompanied by suffering. Could it be possible that the serpent, instead of being an enemy, was a catalyst in God's plan, something that was destined to happen for humanity to evolve spiritually? This idea, of course, would be seen as heresy by any institution that seeks to maintain a rigid and controlling interpretation. Furthermore, the symbolism of the serpent transcends Christianity. In ancient Egypt, it was a symbol of renewal, linked to the cycle of life and death. In Greek tradition, the serpent was associated with Asclepius, god of healing, whose rod is still used as a symbol of medicine. What do these connections tell us about the real role of the serpent in Eden? Perhaps she was never the villain of history, but a misunderstood figure, associated with forbidden knowledge, so feared and persecuted throughout the ages. And here the central question arises: Why transform the snake into a symbol of absolute evil? Maybe because the knowledge it offers is so liberating. An awakened human being, aware of his or her own ability to choose, is much more difficult to control. But if the serpent is a guide to deliverance, what does that say about Adam and Eve? Would they be less victims and more protagonists of a much bigger story, which is yet to be completely revealed? Adam and Eve are often portrayed as ordinary humans, molded from dust and destined for mortality. But what if this is just part of the story? In the book of Adam and Eve, there are descriptions that go beyond the conventional. Adam is presented as a being of colossal stature, with an almost divine brilliance, something that differentiates him from any ordinary human being. These narratives are echoed in Jewish traditions, where Adam is called Adam Kadmon, the spiritual prototype of humanity. Wouldn't it be intriguing to imagine that the first beings were closer to the divine than we have been taught? Some Kabbalistic interpretations suggest that Adam and Eve were angelic figures before the fall. The idea that Adam possessed a divine inner light, lost after his exile from Eden, raises questions about our own nature. Are we all descendants of divine beings who, in some way, chose to experience duality? This view also finds support in 1 Corinthians 15:45, where Paul describes Adam as the first man. But it doesn't stop there. Adam is compared to Christ, a celestial being, suggesting that our origin may be much higher than we imagine. Furthermore, the concept of fallen divine beings is not unique to Christianity. In Zoroastrianism, the first humans are created in a state of purity, losing this connection after a confrontation with evil forces. In Sumerian mythology, gods interact directly with humans, offering knowledge and guidance. Wouldn't it be possible that Adam and Eve are a synthesis of these traditions, adapted for the biblical narrative? If so, the exclusion of details about his divine nature seems like a deliberate effort to keep us from our own spiritual heritage. The most intriguing thing is to think about what it would mean for us if these reports were true. If we are descendants of divine beings, what does that say about our innate abilities? Apocryphal texts, such as the Book of Adam and Eve, seem to suggest that our fall was not an end, but a new beginning, an opportunity to rediscover the divine within ourselves. This perspective, of course, is much less convenient for any narrative that wants to reduce us to mere mortals, dependent on spiritual intermediaries. So perhaps the question is not just who Adam and Eve were, but who we are. If they were divine beings, what stops us from reclaiming that connection? The answer, it seems, may lie in revisiting forgotten and censored stories, those that challenge everything we have been taught. And speaking of challenges, Eva, often seen as guilty, carries within herself an even deeper narrative about the female role in humanity. Have we been fair to her? Eve was marked as the culprit for the fall of humanity. From the first reports, the narrative positions her as responsible for disobedience, transforming her into a symbol of fragility and betrayal. But does this interpretation do justice to what really happened? In the book of Adam and Eve, their story gains a depth rarely explored. Eve is not just the cause of the fall. She's a partner in penance, repentant and active in the search for redemption. This challenges the patriarchal reading that has dominated centuries of theology, where its guilt has been amplified to justify female subjugation. The traditional view of Eve as the source of original sin has been used to shape entire social structures. 1 Timothy 2:14, which states that Eve was deceived, has become a cornerstone for justifying female inferiority in many cultures. But what happens when we look at apocryphal texts, where she is portrayed as a much more complex figure? In the book of Adam and Eve, their pain and regret are no less than Adam's, and their strength in facing the consequences is remarkable. Perhaps the dominant narrative has deliberately simplified its history to reinforce pre-established social roles. Historically, this approach has been convenient for consolidating patriarchal power. Turning Eve into the root of all evil allowed women to be seen as inferior, in need of surveillance and control. But what about cultures that see the feminine as a source of life and wisdom? In ancient Egypt, Isis was the personification of divine wisdom. In Hindu tradition, goddesses represent both creation and destruction in balance. What if Eve was not a villain, but a manifestation of the feminine principle who dared to seek forbidden knowledge? The Book of Adam and Eve also challenges the idea that the fall was unilaterally her fault. Adam and Eve share responsibility, facing the consequences together. This partnership reflects a more balanced and inclusive view of the relationship between genders, something that was not of interest to interpretations that sought to subjugate the feminine. This more egalitarian approach has been conveniently excluded from mainstream narratives, leaving an important gap in the understanding of Eve's role. And so, if Eve isn't the villain we were taught to fear, what does that mean for women throughout history? Perhaps it is time to revisit her story in a new light, freeing her from the interpretations that have placed her as a symbol of weakness and transgression. After all, if she is the mother of us all, wouldn't it be fair to also recognize her as a figure of courage and learning? And when you think about it, what about the tree of knowledge that Eve so desired? Could it be a portal to enlightenment or something even more mysterious? The tree of knowledge has always been surrounded by mystery. Represented as the central element of the fall, it carries a symbolism that transcends religious interpretations. But what does it really represent? In the Book of Adam and Eve, the tree is described as shining, almost resplendent, a detail that makes us question whether we are dealing with something beyond the physical. What if this tree was, in fact, a portal to the divine? Or perhaps an advanced technology incomprehensible to humanity at the time. A provocative idea that challenges centuries of traditional interpretations. Theorists suggest that the tree of knowledge may be a metaphor for advancements beyond our reach. Some compare its description to advanced technologies or even extraterrestrial interventions, such as those narrated in ancient texts such as the Enuma Elish. In these stories, the gods offer knowledge to humans, but always at a cost. Wouldn't it be possible that the tree narrative is an adaptation of this concept? The sin of Adam and Eve, then, could be less a transgression and more a way of breaking a program of divine control. The symbolism of the tree also finds parallels in different cultures. In Gnosticism, it represents the search for supreme knowledge, which frees the soul from ignorance. In Kabbalah, the tree of life reflects the path to spiritual enlightenment, a journey that begins at the base of knowledge and rises to the divine. These interpretations suggest that the tree of knowledge could symbolize a spiritual awakening, something forbidden not because it is evil, but because it is liberating. A perspective that, of course, threatens any system that depends on control over access to knowledge. Historically, the tree of knowledge narrative has been used to reinforce the idea that certain knowledge should remain hidden. After all, a conscious and enlightened people are much more difficult to control. But what if the tree, instead of being a symbol of prohibition, is an invitation to transcend the limitations imposed by ignorance? This thought, naturally, is considered dangerous. And perhaps that is why it has been relegated to apocryphal interpretations and persecuted over the centuries. And now the question remains, what really happened at the foot of the tree of knowledge? Could it be a spiritual portal, a metaphor for human evolution, or something even more enigmatic, like an alien experiment? Whatever the answer, it leads us to question not only what we have been told, but also what has been deliberately withheld from us. And with that in mind, how can these ancient texts, like the Book of Adam and Eve, still threaten modern theology and its power structures? With the advancement of archaeology and access to ancient texts, such as the Book of Adam and Eve, modern theology faces a silent crisis. These writings offer interpretations that challenge established dogma, raising questions that many prefer to avoid. After all, how can we reconcile the vision of a penitent Adam, guided by angels, with the traditional narrative of a condemned and abandoned man? The rediscovery of these texts reveals a more direct and less mediated spirituality, something that threatens the structures that are based on the idea of intermediation between man and God. The danger of these texts for traditional theology lies in the possibility of reformulating concepts such as original sin and redemption. Imagine a narrative where humanity is not essentially condemned, but educated through suffering. Hebrews 8:10 speaks of a law written on hearts, a vision of individual spirituality that contrasts with the institutionalized dependence preached for centuries. It is not difficult to understand why texts like the Book of Adam and Eve were deliberately excluded. They place the power of salvation directly in the hands of the individual. Modern theology also faces another challenge: the historical context of biblical texts. The Book of Adam and Eve draws parallels with Persian, Egyptian, and Sumerian mythologies, suggesting that the scriptures are not exclusively divine, but deeply influenced by ancient cultures. This demystifies the idea of an immaculate Bible and raises uncomfortable questions about its compilation. If scripture is, in part, an adaptation of universal myths, what else could have been shaped or censored to suit specific interests? Furthermore, these texts offer a more optimistic view of humanity. Instead of defeated characters, Adam and Eve are portrayed as spiritual apprentices, accompanied by God, even after the fall. This perspective disarms the discourse of guilt and punishment that supports many doctrines. The rediscovery of apocryphal texts like this could lead to a more individualized spirituality, challenging the need for religious institutions to mediate the relationship between man and the divine. No wonder these texts are seen as a threat. And here's the most intriguing point. If these texts gain acceptance, what will happen to the narratives that have dominated for millennia? Perhaps we are on the verge of a theological revolution, where censored truths finally come to light. But this raises an even deeper question. Are we ready to handle the weight of this knowledge? After all, questioning traditional theology is not just an intellectual exercise, but a spiritual transformation. And if we go further, what other hidden truths await us besides this Book of Adam and Eve? If you want to continue exploring these hidden truths, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Until the next video.